A debt-ridden veteran took a forest inspection job for just $200 a day to avoid eviction. Everyone said it was a dead-end job deep in the mountains, but when he stumbled on something metallic hidden in the dense vegetation, his life changed forever. The abandoned Boeing 747 he found held secrets worth $17 million. Steam rose from the cup of reheated coffee as David Williams stared out the fogged-up kitchen window. At 35, his eyes carried the weight of two wars, the one he'd fought in Iraq and the one he waged every day against the bills piling up on the kitchen table. The red envelope from the bank had been open for 3 days, but he still couldn't look directly at the words, "Final eviction notice," written in capital letters that seemed to scream from the page. His hands, calloused from years of cutting timber in the Oregon forests, trembled slightly as he held the latest medical bill, $80,000. The number danced before him like a life sentence. Every cent was for the leukemia treatment of Zara, his 8-year-old daughter, who slept in the next room, finally in remission, but leaving behind a mountain of debt that grew like a weed. The phone rang, shattering the heavy morning silence. David answered on the third ring, already knowing what he was about to hear. "David, it's Mike, from Northwest Lumber." His boss's voice sounded tired, defeated. "Man, I hate to do this, but the company couldn't recover from the strike. We're shutting down." David closed his eyes. Another blow. Another hole in the floor that was already opening up beneath his feet. "I understand, Mike. When? Today's your last day, man. Sorry. I know you've got situations. As if his daughter's life was just a situation. After hanging up, David stood motionless in the kitchen, listening to the hum of the old refrigerator and the distant rumble of trucks on the highway. Rainier, Oregon, wasn't the kind of place where opportunities grew on trees, even though it was surrounded by forests. It was a town that lived on timber, and when the timber ran out, people left. But David couldn't leave. Zara was finally stable. The doctors in Portland were the best, and moving a child in remission felt riskier than facing any battlefield he had ever known. That afternoon, after clearing out his locker at the sawmill for the last time, David stopped at Murphy's Diner. The place smelled of fry oil and lost hope. He ordered a coffee and pretended to read the local paper while listening to the conversations around him. It was then he overheard Tommy Reeves, a local hunter, talking to the waiter about a strange job. Forest Service is offering $200 a day for someone to do an inspection in the Cascades. Remote area, no decent road. No one wants the job because it's too isolated. David looked up. $200 a day was more than he made cutting timber. "Where exactly?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Tommy turned around. "Sector 47 up in the mountains, near the old mining area. They say it's just hiking, documenting wildlife, marking sick trees. Lonely work, but money's money." That night, David found the contact for the Forest Service and called. The voice on the other end was bureaucratic, impersonal. "We need someone who can handle being alone in the woods for weeks. Basic cabin, emergency radio, simple monitoring work. It pays well because nobody wants to be isolated up there." David glanced at the photo of Zara on his nightstand, her brave smile still there even during the hardest days of her treatment. She trusted him to find a way. He always did. "I'll take the job," David said, his voice firm for the first time in weeks. 2 weeks later, he was driving an old government pickup down a dirt road that looked more like a goat trail. The Cascade Mountains rose around him like sleeping giants, covered in a morning mist that made everything seem like a dream. The GPS had lost its signal an hour ago, but the instructions scribbled on the paper seemed clear. Drive until you can't drive anymore, then hike another 3 miles. When he finally stopped the truck and grabbed his pack, David felt something familiar in his chest. The same feeling he got before missions in Iraq, a mix of apprehension and purpose. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to stumble upon the greatest secret those mountains had kept for decades. The air smelled of pine and damp earth as he started walking deeper into the woods, following the markings on the map. With every step, he felt as if he were distancing himself not just from civilization, but from all the problems that were suffocating him. For a moment, he could almost forget the bills, the debts, the constant fear of losing everything. Almost. But before we continue, I want to ask you, could you stay calm and think clearly in a situation like this? Go to the comments and leave your opinion. I want to read them all. Now let's get back to the story. The Forest Service cabin was exactly where the map indicated, nestled among giant pines like a healed wound on the landscape. The wooden planks were faded by time, and the corrugated metal roof showed rust stains that looked like dark tears running down the edges. David dropped his pack on the floor with a dull thud and looked around. The solitude was as thick as the mist clinging to the treetops. For the first 3 days, he followed the established routine. Wake up before dawn, check the coordinates on the handheld GPS, hike through the designated sectors marking sick trees, and document signs of wildlife. The work was monotonous, but the daily pay meant that, for a few weeks at least, he could keep the bills at bay. On the 4th morning, a thick fog covered the forest like a wet blanket. David decided to explore an area further north, following an old deer trail that snaked between moss-covered trunks. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the sound of his footsteps crushing damp leaves and the occasional snap of dry twigs. It was when the terrain began to change that he noticed something strange. The vegetation grew thicker, wilder, as if nature were deliberately trying to hide something. Thick vines intertwined between the trees, forming nearly impenetrable green walls. David had to use his knife to clear a path, cutting through vines that seemed to have decades of growth. Then his foot hit something that was definitely not a rock. The sound was different, a hollow, metallic thud that echoed strangely in the silent forest. David stopped, frowning. He pushed some leaves aside with his boot, and again felt the same solid resistance. He knelt and began to dig with his hands, removing layers of decomposed leaves, dark earth, and tangled roots. His fingernails scraped against metal, smooth, painted metal, hidden under decades of forest growth. David felt his heart quicken, the same adrenaline he'd felt when his unit found something suspicious on patrol. He worked faster, using his hands and knife to clear the area. Slowly, a curved surface emerged from the earth, covered in faded white paint with nearly invisible blue stripes. It wasn't natural. It was too big to be abandoned junk, too solid to be common debris. David took a few steps back and scanned the area with a soldier's eyes, trying to identify patterns in the vegetation. That's when he realized the clearing wasn't natural. The oldest trees formed an almost perfect circle around the site, as if something large had landed there decades ago, and the forest had grown up and around it, completely hiding whatever it was. He walked around the area using his knife to cut away more vegetation. With every cleared foot, more metal appeared. A straight line here, a gentle curve there. His veteran's brain began to piece together the puzzle. It was a plane, a big plane. David stopped digging and backed away, breathing heavily. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from sheer disbelief. In front of him, partially buried and completely camouflaged by 40 years of forest growth, was what appeared to be an entire commercial airplane. He returned to the cabin that day in a daze, barely able to process what he had found. He lay awake all night, staring at the wooden ceiling, trying to find a logical explanation. A crash? An emergency landing? Why hadn't anyone searched for it? Why were there no records? The next morning, he returned to the site armed with a powerful flashlight, ropes, and basic tools from the cabin. The daylight confirmed his suspicions from the night before. It was definitely a commercial aircraft, a Boeing from the shape of the fuselage he could make out. The vegetation had grown so densely around it that from the surface it just looked like another plant-covered mound. David found what looked like a cargo door on the rear of the aircraft. The metal was corroded, but the frame remained solid. He spent an hour prying it open with a makeshift lever, sweat pouring down his face as he fought against decades of rust and tangled branches. When the door finally gave way with a long, metallic groan, a rush of stale, stagnant air escaped from within. It smelled of mold, oxidized metal, and something else, something vaguely chemical that made David instinctively take a few steps back. He switched on his flashlight and aimed it into the aircraft's interior. The beam of light revealed rows of seats covered in a thin layer of dust but surprisingly preserved. There were no bodies, no scattered luggage, no sign of panic or a crash. The cabin was strangely organized, as if the passengers had simply stepped out for a snack and never returned. But it was when David aimed the flashlight toward the rear of the aircraft that his blood ran cold. The cargo hold was filled with military crates, dozens of them, stacked methodically, each marked with symbols he recognized immediately from his days in the service. Department of Defense symbols, classification codes, and stamped clearly on the side of several crates, almost like a ghostly signature from the past. CIA, 1975. David swallowed hard. His chance discovery had just turned into something much bigger and far more dangerous than a simple, forgotten plane crash. David stood at the entrance to the cargo hold for several minutes, the beam of his flashlight trembling in his hands. The air inside the aircraft was heavy and stale, thick with decades of silence. Every breath brought the metallic taste of still time, mixed with the sweet, cloying odor of something that had rotted long ago. He stepped inside slowly, testing each footstep on the metal floor. His years of military training screamed at him to be careful. Abandoned places were always potential traps, but his curiosity was stronger than his caution. The crates were arranged in perfect rows like soldiers in formation, each labeled with codes that sent his veteran's mind into overdrive. The first crate he opened was sealed with a standard military latch he recognized immediately. The rust had made the mechanism stiff, but David managed to force it open using a wrench he found in a toolkit attached to the aircraft wall. When the lid popped open with a dry snap, the flashlight beam illuminated something that took his breath away. Gold bars. 14 of them, each the size of a brick, nestled in protective foam like precious eggs in an incubator. The gold metal caught the flashlight's light and reflected it in mesmerizing waves, creating a warm glow that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. David reached out hesitantly, touching one of the bars. It was heavy, cold, real. His hands shook as he lifted the bar. It must have weighed about 10 kilos. Even with his limited knowledge of precious metals, David knew he was holding a fortune. He carefully placed the bar back and opened the next crate. Raw diamonds, hundreds of them, stored in small velvet bags inside padded compartments. Some were as small as peas, others as large as quail eggs. Even uncut, they shone with an inner light that seemed to capture and amplify every photon from his flashlight. David scooped up a handful and let them roll between his fingers like magic gravel. The third crate revealed something even more bewildering: cultural artifacts that were clearly not American. Elaborately carved bronze statuettes, depicting figures in dancing poses David didn't recognize. Small jade Buddhas, their serene faces watching him across the centuries. Wrought gold necklaces with intricate designs that seemed to tell stories in a visual language he couldn't decipher. Each new discovery heightened both his excitement and his unease. These weren't American treasures. They looked Asian, Vietnamese, maybe Cambodian or Laotian. And the date on the crates, 1975, coincided perfectly with the end of the Vietnam War. David kept opening crates like a man possessed. Each one revealed more riches. Silver plates with inscriptions and characters that looked like Khmer. Ceremonial masks covered in gold leaf. Small ivory carvings so detailed that every muscle fiber of the sculpted elephants was visible. It was in the 10th crate that he found the documents. Wrapped in military-grade waterproof plastic, the papers were surprisingly well preserved. David pulled out a thick stack and aimed his flashlight at the first few pages. The official letterhead made his stomach turn. Operation Phoenix Rising. Classified. Eyes only. His hands trembled as he flipped through the documents. Mission reports, inventory lists, transfer orders, all dated between March and April 1975. The place names leaped off the page. Saigon, Phnom Penh, Vientiane. Cities David knew from history books and from the stories older vets told in dark bars. One particular page made his blood run cold. It was a detailed list of cultural assets recovered for preservation during emergency evacuation. Every item he had just seen was meticulously catalogued. 47 standard gold bars, approx. Weight 470 kilo, 386 raw diamonds of various grades, 273 Khmer cultural artifacts recovered from the National Museum of Cambodia. David sat down heavily on one of the crates, trying to process the magnitude of what he was reading. This wasn't just a lucky find. It was evidence of a secret military operation that had recovered, or stolen, entire cultural treasures during the fall of Southeast Asia. He kept reading, finding reports detailing how field agents had secured significant cultural assets from imminent communist destruction. The language was sanitized, bureaucratic, but the reality was clear. During the chaos of the collapse of Saigon and Phnom Penh, someone had systematically looted museums, temples, and private collections. At the bottom of the document crate, David found something that hit him like a punch to the gut. Photographs. Dozens of them in black and white showing American soldiers carrying crates identical to the ones he was seeing. Buddhist temples with empty display cases, museum rooms completely stripped bare, and in several photos a recurring figure, an army major with the name taped D. Morrison sewn onto his uniform. The last thing David found in the crate was a personal diary, bound in worn brown leather. On the cover, embossed in faded gold letters, Major David Bulldog Morrison, Personal Memoirs. His hands trembled as he opened the first page. The handwriting was steady, but the words carried the weight of a man wrestling with his conscience. April 15th, 1975. I can't sleep anymore. What began as a preservation mission has become something I can no longer justify to myself. Yes, we saved these treasures from the bombings and the destruction that is sure to come, but we also stole them from a people who may never see them again. Every Buddha we packed, every statuette we catalogued, I feel as though I'm taking part in a crime against history. David read page after page, absorbing the moral struggle of a soldier who had been ordered to preserve cultural treasures, but who gradually realized he was participating in the greatest art heist in modern history. Morrison described his growing guilt, his certainty that these objects should return home as soon as the situation stabilized. The final diary entry, dated May 3, 1975, made David swallow hard. The order came down today. We fly tomorrow to a secret stateside base where these assets will be stored indefinitely for national security. But I can't be a part of it. I'm going to arrange a crash landing. I'll hide all of this until the world is ready to do the right thing. May God forgive me for what we've done, and may He guide me to make this right someday. David closed the diary, his hands shaking violently now. It wasn't just a fortune in gold and diamonds. It was a time capsule of guilt and redemption, hidden by a man who tried to fix a terrible wrong committed in the name of national security. He aimed the flashlight around the cargo hold one last time, seeing the crates in a new light. They weren't abandoned treasures. They were artifacts stolen from people who had lost everything during one of the most brutal wars of the 20th century. And somehow, 47 years later, they had fallen into his hands. David stumbled out of the aircraft, his mind reeling with the implications. The cool forest air had never felt so necessary. He leaned against a tree, trying to calculate not just the financial value of what he'd found, easily $17 million, maybe more, but the moral weight of possessing secrets that governments had buried for decades. When he could finally move, David looked back at the aircraft hidden in the vegetation. It was more than a discovery. It was a choice that would define the rest of his life. But before we continue, I want to ask you, and if it were you, what would you do? Go to the comments and leave your opinion. I want to read them all. Now let's get back to the story. The handwriting was steady, but the words carried the weight of a man wrestling with his conscience. April 15th, 1975. I can't sleep anymore. What began as a preservation mission has become something I can no longer justify to myself. Yes, we saved these treasures from the bombings and the destruction that is sure to come, but we also stole them from a people who may never see them again. Every Buddha we packed, every statuette we catalogued, I feel as though I'm taking part in a crime against history. David read page after page, absorbing the moral struggle of a soldier who had been ordered to preserve cultural treasures, but who gradually realized he was participating in the greatest art heist in modern history. Morrison described his growing guilt, his certainty that these objects should return home as soon as the situation stabilized. The final diary entry, dated May 3, 1975, made David swallow hard. The order came down today. We fly tomorrow to a secret stateside base where these assets will be stored indefinitely for national security. But I can't be a part of it. I'm going to arrange a crash landing. I'll hide all of this until the world is ready to do the right thing. May God forgive me for what we've done, and may He guide me to make this right someday. David closed the diary, his hands shaking violently now. It wasn't just a fortune in gold and diamonds. It was a time capsule of guilt and redemption, hidden by a man who tried to fix a terrible wrong committed in the name of national security. He aimed the flashlight around the cargo hold one last time, seeing the crates in a new light. They weren't abandoned treasures. They were artifacts stolen from people who had lost everything during one of the most brutal wars of the 20th century, and somehow, 47 years later, they had fallen into his hands. David stumbled out of the aircraft, his mind reeling with the implications. The cool forest air had never felt so necessary. He leaned against a tree, trying to calculate not just the financial value of what he'd found, easily $17 million, maybe more, but the moral weight of possessing secrets that governments had buried for decades. When he could finally move, David looked back at the aircraft hidden in the vegetation. It was more than a discovery. It was a choice that would define the rest of his life. That night, David couldn't eat. He sat at the cabin table with Major Morrison's diary open before him, a cup of coffee growing cold beside him as he read every word again. The faint light from the kerosene lamp danced across the yellowed pages, making the words seem to pulse as if they were alive. Morrison's handwriting changed over the months. At first it was precise, military, professional, but as the entries progressed, it became more erratic, more urgent. David could feel the weight of guilt growing in every line, as if the paper itself were absorbing the man's desperation. March 22, 1975. Today we entered the National Museum of Phnom Penh. The curator, an elderly man named Dr. Sophia, wept when he saw our trucks. He begged us to leave at least the most sacred pieces. They are the soul of our people, he said in broken English. But my orders were clear. Everything of value must be preserved from the communist advance. Preserved or stolen? The line is getting too blurry for me. David closed his eyes, imagining the scene. American soldiers systematically emptying museums, while an entire civilization crumbled around them. He knew that kind of preservation. He had seen similar things in Iraq, protected artifacts that never returned to their homes. He continued reading, finding loose photographs tucked between the diary's pages. One showed Morrison posing with his unit in front of a Buddhist temple. Everyone was smiling for the camera, but Morrison looked uneasy, his eyes avoiding the photographer. Another photo showed crates being loaded onto a military truck, empty temples in the background like open wounds on the landscape. It was then that David noticed something he had missed before. In several photographs, Morrison wore a distinctive ring, a military ring with a specific insignia. And on the last page of the diary, scribbled in the margin in different ink, was a symbol that made David stop breathing for a moment. A stylized eagle holding an olive branch, with the initials PR engraved beneath it. The same symbol was discreetly stamped on several of the crates he had opened. David returned to the official documents, searching for references to the symbol. He found it in a folder marked Project Phoenix Rising Recovery Protocols. The project had an official objective: to preserve cultural assets of historical significance during emergency evacuation operations in the Southeast Asian theater. But the subtext told a different story. David, with his military experience, recognized the coded language. Cultural assets meant anything of value. Preservation meant confiscation. Evacuation operations meant organized looting during the chaos of the American withdrawal. A specific folder made his heart race. Inside, he found a complete profile of Major David Morrison, born in 1935 in Cedar Falls, Iowa, veteran of 2 tours in Vietnam, specialist in logistics and sensitive materials acquisition. The official photo showed a square-jawed man with serious eyes, bearing the same determined expression David recognized in veterans who had seen too much. But it was the last document in the folder that revealed the true mystery. A military investigation report dated September 15, 1975. Subject: disappearance of classified transport and cargo aircraft status. Unsolved. Summary: on May 4, 1975, the military transport Boeing 747 assigned to Operation Phoenix Rising failed to arrive at its scheduled destination, Edwards Air Force Base, California. The aircraft, piloted by Major David Morrison and carrying recovered cultural assets with an estimated value of $17.3 million, disappeared from radar over the Cascade Mountains, Oregon. Search and rescue, a 30-day search operation, failed to locate wreckage or survivors. Classification: incident remains highly classified under national security. David reread the report 3 times. Morrison hadn't been the victim of an accident. He had deliberately vanished with the cargo, hiding it in the mountains exactly where David had found it 4 decades later. Flipping through more documents, David found personal letters that Morrison had written but apparently never sent. One was addressed to his wife, Susan, in Cedar Falls. My dearest Susan, if you are reading this, then I managed to do the right thing, even if it cost me everything. What we did over there wasn't preservation, it was pure and simple theft. We stole the soul of a people when they needed it most. I can't live knowing I contributed to that. I will hide everything where no one can find it until the world is ready to return these things to their rightful owners. Please forgive me for choosing honor over our family, but I could not choose our happiness over justice. Another letter was even more revealing, addressed to whomever finds this. My name is David Morrison and I am a thief, not by choice, but by orders. During the evacuation of Saigon and Phnom Penh, I took part in the systematic looting of cultural treasures belonging to the people of Cambodia and Vietnam. We were told we were preserving these artifacts from communist destruction, but I know the truth. We were stealing sacred relics from people who had already lost everything. This aircraft contains approximately $17 million in gold, diamonds, and cultural artifacts. Every piece was stolen from temples, museums, or families during the chaos of war. I am hiding everything here because I cannot be part of a crime against human history. If you have found this, I implore you to do what I could not. Return these things to their rightful owners. The people of Southeast Asia lost everything. Their homes, their families, their culture. At least their cultural heritage can go home. David folded the letter carefully, his hands shaking. The moral magnitude of the situation washed over him in successive waves. Morrison had sacrificed his career, his family, probably his life, to keep these treasures from being lost forever in some secret government warehouse. He examined the photographs again, now with different eyes. In one of them, Morrison was kneeling beside a Buddhist temple, his expression clearly anguished. The caption, handwritten on the back, Wat Phnom, Phnom Penh, the day I became a thief. Another photo showed Cambodian children watching American soldiers carry crates from a temple. Their faces were masks of confusion and fear. On the back, Morrison had written, "These children will never see these Buddhas again. May God forgive me." David closed the diary and leaned back in the wooden chair. Outside, the night wind whistled through the pines, making the cabin groan softly. He thought of Zara, asleep in her bed in Portland, trusting that her father would find a way to pay her medical bills. He thought of the $80,000 he owed, of the house he would lose if he didn't get money soon, and he thought of Morrison's words, "Return these things to their rightful owners." David looked out the window into the dark forest, knowing the aircraft lay there like an open wound on the conscience of history. Morrison had made his choice 40 years ago, sacrificing everything to do what he thought was right. Now it was David's turn to choose. David woke up on the third day after the discovery, to the sound of rotors slicing through the morning air. He leaped out of bed and rushed to the window, pulling aside the faded curtain. 3 military helicopters were flying in low formation over the treetops, their rotors creating waves of wind that made the pines sway violently. His blood ran cold. They weren't Forest Service helicopters. They were military Blackhawks, the kind used in classified operations. David watched as they circled the area where he had found the aircraft, their flight patterns too systematic to be a coincidence. He grabbed the emergency radio and tuned it to frequencies he knew from his time in the service. Static on most channels, but on a military frequency, he picked up fragments of conversation. Sweep of Sector 47 complete. No visual disturbance detected. Continue monitoring. David turned off the radio, his hands shaking. Someone was looking for something, and he had a strong suspicion what it was. For the rest of the morning, he stayed inside the cabin, watching through the gaps in the curtains. The helicopters returned twice, flying lower each time. On the second pass, David was certain he saw thermal sensing equipment hanging from the aircraft's hulls. At noon, his satellite phone rang. The voice on the other end was formal, efficient. "Mr. Washington, this is Agent Sarah Chen, Department of Homeland Security. We need to speak with you about your activities in the forest area. We'll be there in 2 hours." The line went dead before David could reply. He paced back and forth in the small cabin, his military mind shifting into survival mode. He thought about destroying Morrison's diary, about burying the evidence he had brought back from the aircraft. But something stopped him. Morrison's words echoed in his head, "Do what I could not." 2 hours later, exactly as promised, 2 black SUVs pulled up on the trail leading to the cabin. David watched through the window as 4 people got out of the vehicles. 3 men in suits and an Asian American woman with her hair pulled back in a professional expression. Agent Chen knocked on the door with 3 precise raps. "Mr. Washington, we're with the federal government. We'd like to ask you a few questions about your work here." David opened the door, keeping his expression neutral. 20 years in the Army had taught him how to handle interrogations. "How can I help you?" Chen flashed her credentials. "We've received reports of unauthorized activity in this area. Reconnaissance drones have detected disturbances in the vegetation patterns of the northern sector. Have you been in that region?" David kept his tone casual. "I'm paid to inspect the whole area. I walk around documenting wildlife and marking sick trees." One of the men in suits, tall and thin with a scar on his chin, stepped forward. "Agent Rodriguez, FBI. Mr. Washington, you have an extensive military background. You certainly recognize military equipment when you see it." "Yes, sir." Then you'll understand our concern when sensing equipment detected large metallic signatures buried in the forest. Signatures consistent with an aircraft. David felt sweat bead on his forehead, but he kept his voice steady. I haven't seen any aircraft, Agent Rodriguez. Chen crossed her arms. Mr. Washington, let's be direct. This area is under a federal investigation related to classified materials lost during historical military operations. Any interference with evidence or removal of government property is a federal crime, punishable by up to 20 years in prison. The third man, shorter and stockier, finally spoke. Agent Thompson, CIA. These historical operations involved national security materials that remain highly sensitive even decades later. If you've discovered anything, it is your patriotic duty to report it immediately. David looked each of them in the eye. He recognized the tactic, escalating pressure, appeals to patriotism, legal threats. But he also saw something else. Desperation. They didn't know exactly what he had found, only that something had been disturbed. Gentlemen, ma'am, David said calmly, I understand your concerns, but I'm just a temporary forest inspector doing my job. If you have specific evidence that I've committed a crime, I'm willing to cooperate through the proper legal channels. Otherwise, I need to get back to my work. Chen and Rodriguez exchanged a glance. Thompson took a step closer. Mr. Washington, you served with honor in Iraq, decorated for bravery. Surely you understand that some secrets exist to protect American lives. I understand perfectly, David replied. I also understand that some secrets exist to protect crimes. The silence that followed was as taut as barbed wire. Thompson narrowed his eyes. That sounds like a very serious accusation, Sergeant. Just an observation, Agent Thompson. Chen intervened. Mr. Washington will leave our card. If you discover anything at all, that might be of national interest, we expect your immediate call. After they left, David stood on the cabin's porch for a long time, watching the dust settle on the road. They would be back, and next time, it wouldn't be to ask polite questions. That night, David didn't light the cabin's lamps. He sat in the dark, thinking. Morrison's diary was hidden under a loose floorboard, along with some of the most incriminating photographs. But he knew that if the federal agents really wanted to find evidence, they would. His phone rang. Blocked number. Daddy? Zara's voice sounded small and distant. Where are you? Mommy's worried. David closed his eyes. He had separated from his ex-wife 2 years earlier, but they still lived in Portland, depending on him for Zara's medical bills. I'm working, Princess. I'll be back soon. The men came here today, Zara said, her voice lower now. They asked Mommy questions about you. She got scared. David's stomach tightened. What kind of questions, Zara? About your work. About money. One of them asked if you had brought anything home lately. Valuable things. David clenched his free fist. Zara, listen carefully. If anyone else comes asking questions, you tell them to talk to a lawyer, okay? And you and your mom stay safe. Daddy will take care of everything. After hanging up, David walked to the window and looked out at the dark forest. Out there, Morrison's aircraft lay buried with its $17 million secrets. Enough treasure to pay all of Zara's medical bills, buy a house, secure her future. But now there were federal agents threatening his family. There were military helicopters flying over the area, and there were Morrison's words echoing in his conscience. Return these things to their rightful owners. David thought about his tour in Iraq, about the things he had seen American soldiers confiscate for national security. He thought of the faces of Iraqi children watching their toys being searched by foreign soldiers. He thought of Morrison, a man who had chosen conscience over career, and he thought of Zara, depending on him to survive, trusting that her father would do the right thing. The weight of the choice pressed down on his shoulders like a pack filled with lead. On one hand, the financial salvation that could change everything for his family. On the other, the moral responsibility to deliver historical justice. David looked up at the stars through the treetops, knowing that the morning would bring decisions that would define not just his future, but the kind of man he truly was. Out there, in the darkness of the forest, Morrison's Boeing waited patiently, holding its secrets like a buried conscience, waiting for someone brave enough to do what was right. David didn't sleep that night. He sat at the cabin table, Morrison's diary open before him, a pen in one hand and his phone in the other. The Major's words echoed in his mind like a mantra. Do what I couldn't do. By dawn, his decision was made. He called the first number on his list. Michael Chen, an investigative journalist for the Portland Oregonian who had covered military scandals in the past. The sleepy voice on the other end woke up quickly as David began to speak. "Mr. Chen, my name is David Washington. I'm an Iraq veteran, and I've just discovered evidence of a secret 1975 military operation that resulted in the systematic theft of $17 million worth of cultural artifacts from Southeast Asia." 2 hours later, Chen was at the cabin with a camera crew. David showed him the diary, the photographs, the official documents. The journalist flipped through the pages with trembling hands, his eyes widening with each revelation. "My God," Chen murmured. This is going to shake the government." "It's not about shaking the government," David said firmly. "It's about doing the right thing. These pieces were stolen from people who lost everything during the war. They deserve to go home." While Chen documented everything, David made his second call to Dr. Elena Vasquez, a lawyer specializing in the repatriation of cultural artifacts, whom he had found online. Her voice was professional, but David detected a growing excitement as he explained the situation. "Mr. Washington," she said, "what you're describing could be the most significant case of cultural repatriation in modern history. But you need to understand, taking on the American government on this issue will be a legal battle that could last for years." "Dr. Vasquez," David replied, "I've faced worse for lesser causes." On the third day, David made the hardest call of all. He called Agent Chen, the federal agent who had interrogated him. "Agent Chen, it's David Washington. I'd like to schedule a meeting. I have information about what you're looking for." 2 hours later, the same black SUVs were back. But this time, David wasn't alone. Michael Chen was there with his camera, Dr. Vasquez with a briefcase full of legal documents, and a third man David had specifically asked to be present, Robert "Tank" Morrison, the son of Major David Morrison. Tank Morrison was 42, worked as a high school history teacher in Portland, and had spent his entire life believing his father had died a hero in a plane crash. When David contacted him and explained the truth, Tank had been silent for 5 full minutes. Now he sat in the small cabin holding his father's diary, tears streaming silently down his face. Agent Chen entered the cabin and stopped short upon seeing the cameras. "Mr. Washington, what is this?" David stood up, holding a copy of the documents he had found. "Agent Chen, I would like to present evidence of war crimes committed by the United States government in 1975, specifically the systematic theft of cultural heritage during Operation Phoenix Rising." The silence in the cabin was deafening. Agent Rodriguez and Thompson flanked Chen, their expressions hardening. "Mr. Washington," Thompson said slowly, "you are stepping into very dangerous territory." "No, Agent Thompson," David replied calmly. "I've been in dangerous territory for 40 years, ever since my government decided that stealing the cultural heritage of a people at war was acceptable policy." Tank Morrison stood up, still holding his father's diary. "Agents, my name is Robert Morrison. This diary belonged to my father, Major David Morrison. For 40 years I believed he died serving his country with honor. Now I've discovered he truly did die serving his country with honor, by trying to undo a crime he was forced to commit." Dr. Vasquez opened her briefcase. "Agents, I represent an international coalition of lawyers specializing in cultural repatriation. Based on the evidence presented by Mr. Washington, we will be filing both domestic and international lawsuits to ensure these artifacts are returned to their countries of origin." Michael Chen turned on his camera. "And I will be documenting the entire process for the American public, who have the right to know how their government conducted operations in their name." Agent Thompson took a step forward, his voice menacing. "Mr. Washington, you are committing treason." David looked him directly in the eye. "Agent Thompson, I swore an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That includes defending the American values of justice and morality, even when my own government abandons them." The tension in the room was palpable. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Agent Chen sighed deeply. "Mr. Washington, do you understand that you are forcing a situation that could have enormous diplomatic ramifications?" "I understand perfectly," David replied, "and I accept that responsibility." In the days that followed, the story exploded in the national media. The images of the hidden aircraft, the official documents, Morrison's anguished diary, it all became front-page news. The American public was divided between those who supported David as a moral hero and those who saw him as a traitor. But something unexpected happened. Veterans from across the country began to get in touch, sharing their own stories of morally questionable orders they had received. Academics specializing in cultural heritage joined the cause. Human rights activists organized rallies in support. 3 weeks after the initial revelation, David received a call that would change everything. "Mr. Washington, this is Ambassador Pitch Sophia, representative of the Kingdom of Cambodia to the United Nations. I am the grandson of Dr. Sophia, the curator who pleaded with Major Morrison to leave the sacred artifacts in Phnom Penh. I would like to fly to Portland to meet you in person." The meeting took place in a conference room in downtown Portland. Ambassador Sophia was a gentleman in his 60s, with eyes that carried the wisdom of generations. When David showed him the photographs of the Khmer artifacts, the ambassador wept openly. "Mr. Washington," he said through his tears, "these pieces, they are the soul of my people. They were stolen during our darkest days, when we lost 2 million lives to the Khmer Rouge. My grandfather died believing our cultural heritage had been lost forever." David felt a lump in his throat. "Ambassador, they're going home. You have my word as a soldier." The legal process that followed was complex and arduous. The American government initially tried to classify everything under national security, but the public and international pressure was too intense. Southeast Asian countries united in a diplomatic front, demanding the repatriation of the artifacts. 6 months after the initial discovery, a deal was reached. The U.S. government would officially acknowledge that Operation Phoenix Rising had exceeded its legal authority, and all cultural artifacts would be returned to their countries of origin through an internationally supervised repatriation program. In exchange for his cooperation and transparency, David would receive a substantial reward from the federal whistleblower program. $3 million, enough to pay all of Zara's medical bills and secure her educational future. But for David, the real reward came the day the artifacts began their journey home. He was present at the Portland airport when the first crates were loaded onto a plane bound for Phnom Penh. Ambassador Sophia was there too, his hands shaking as he reverently touched the crates containing the sacred Buddhas of his people. "Mr. Washington," the ambassador said, "you didn't just return objects. You returned our dignity." Tank Morrison was there too, now working as a consultant on the repatriation program. He had used his father's diary to write a book about the experience of soldiers forced to take part in morally ambiguous operations. "You know," Tank said to David as they watched the plane take off, "my father tried to do the right thing by hiding these treasures, but you did the right thing by returning them. He would be proud." David thought of David Morrison, a man who had chosen conscience over career, morality over blind obedience, a man who had hidden a fortune not to get rich, but to protect it until someone brave enough came along to complete his mission. 2 years later, David stood on a small stage in Rainier, Oregon, in front of the crowd gathered for the dedication of the Morrison Memorial, a monument to soldiers who chose conscience over convenience. Morrison's aircraft had been carefully excavated and transported to become the centerpiece of the memorial, preserved as a reminder that doing the right thing sometimes requires extraordinary sacrifices. Zara, now 10 years old and in full remission, was in the front row, smiling proudly at her father. Beside her, his ex-wife Linda held a sign that read, "Proud to be a moral hero's family." David looked out at the audience. Veterans, activists, local families, representatives from Southeast Asian countries who had traveled to thank him personally, all united by a simple belief that doing the right thing is worth any price. "My name is David Washington," he began, his voice carrying the weight of experience and the strength of conviction. 2 years ago, I was desperate, broke, and ready to take any opportunity that would help me save my daughter. I thought I had found a buried treasure. In fact, I found something far more valuable. He paused, looking out at the attentive faces. I found proof that an ordinary soldier can change the world when he chooses to do what is right instead of what is easy. David Morrison taught me that some battles aren't fought with weapons but with conscience, and that true wealth is not in what we keep for ourselves, but in what we share with the world. David looked at the preserved aircraft behind him, now transformed from a secret tomb into a beacon of hope. "Major Morrison, mission accomplished, sir. The treasures are home." As applause echoed through the Oregon forest, David thought of the words he had found in Morrison's diary 2 years earlier. "Do what I couldn't do." He had done exactly that. And in doing so, he had discovered that the greatest discovery of all wasn't the gold or the diamonds buried in the forest. It was the discovery that an ordinary man facing extraordinary circumstances could still choose to be extraordinary. The afternoon breeze whispered through the pines, carrying with it the sound of families laughing, children playing, and the promise that some stories, the ones that truly matter, are never really buried. They just wait for the right person to bring them to light. David Williams found much more than a hidden fortune in the Cascade Mountains. He found proof that doing the right thing, even when it costs everything, is the only wealth truly worth leaving for the next generation. And sometimes, when we follow our conscience instead of our bank account, we discover that the real treasure wasn't what we were looking for. It was who we became while looking for it. If you enjoyed this story of discovery, courage, and moral choice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories about ordinary people who did extraordinary things. Click the next video to discover another incredible journey of transformation. And share this story if you believe that doing the right thing is always worth more than doing the easy thing.